All right. And okay, so we should be live now. So this is the Synth Summit Show, episode number 36. And the show's been very sporadic lately. And that's usually because what happens is I get a guest set in my mind, and I'm like, well, I'm not doing another show until I do that show. So even when schedules get goofy, and it's usually my fault, I should add, I just tend to
I take as much credit for this one, by the way.
No, listen, my schedule was just as crazy. So, we both had a lot going on at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So, I want to introduce Marco Alpert, who we have had on the show before. And we've done also on the Beat People podcast before, but we've never discussed this information. So, what I want to do is just quickly, Marco, I'm going to have you kind of introduce yourself a little bit and just give us a quick bullet point list of who you are and why you're on the show today.
Okay. My career for way too many years has been in marketing and product planning and electronic musical instruments. I was briefly back in the 70s a composer using synthesizers to write music for low budget films, industrial films, that sort of thing. Basically learned my chops on an ARC 2600. But in the process of buying that 2600, I went to a music store. I ran into a guy named Ed Rudnick, who was friends with a couple of guys who were actually making their own synthesizers, which seemed astonishing to me that anyone could do that. And that was Dave Russell, Scott Wedge of E-MU Systems. And he introduced me to them. And I couldn't afford their synthesizers. They were great, but beyond my budget. But we stayed friends for a few years. And when I was in the Bay Area at that time, when I eventually moved down to LA, because that's where most of my work was coming from, I pitched E-MU on letting me become sort of an independent sales rep for them, because I didn't have a lot of presence down there. The main point of which was being able to buy an E-MU synthesizer at a substantial discount in order to be a sales rep. And I did that for a few years. And in the late 70s, they decided to start asking me to come and work for them full-time up in Santa Cruz. I resisted for a year or so because I had an illusion that I was building a career in Los Angeles. And in 79, I agreed to come and work for them for 1 year and then stayed for 15 years through amazing times there. And in the early to mid 90s, E-MU went through a lot of stuff. They were purchased by Creative Labs in Singapore. Dave became the chief scientist of Creative Labs, established a advanced technology group at E-MU. The president who had taken us through that sale left on the day the sale completed. Other people took over. I stayed for about a year or so, decided it was probably time to make a change, and had an opportunity to join Akai as a strategic marketing consultant. And I did, and I was there for 4 years, very exciting years, which is what we're largely going to be talking about today. And then once I was at Akai, they went through a lot of drama. Akai, the main company of Akai was a consumer electronics company. The electronic music division was a very small part of it, but it was the profitable part of it. And a couple of years after I came, Akai was sold out of troubled times to a company in Hong Kong called Sumitech Global Limited. And I was there for a couple of years. And then for a lot of reasons, it was obvious that my future was not there. And I left and joined Antares Audio Technologies, the Auto-Tune people, where I was the VP of marketing there for 16 years. Left there in 2014 with great joy, rejoined Dave Rossum from E-MU, and the two of us started Rossum Electro Music to create some new synthesizers, some new modular synthesizers, which seemed like an incredible thing to be able to do all those years later. And then about a year or so ago, I retired. And that was basically my career. I'm still involved peripherally with Rossum Electro. I'm still a part owner of the company, and I'm happy to give them any advice when they feel like it. And now I'm here talking about the past.
That's wonderful, and that's like, I mean, that's really
Mm-hmm.
that career is like the whole chunk of like my music tech life. Is like of just like I'm talking from, you know, barely being aware that something like music tech exists to, you know, to present. So it's an honor to get to talk to you, and I'm very thankful for you coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, believe me.
So I think what I want to do here is so we've had you on the show before, and in other shows that I'm involved with, and I've spoken to you at trade shows and whatnot, and it's always been related to Rossum stuff. What I wanted to do is I wanted to get more insight into kind of this weird beige era of of Akai that
Uh-huh.
I you know, haven't really heard too much behind the scenes about. This is
Mhm.
all stuff that you know, is a little bit more recent than some of the like the earlier EMU type stuff that was
Mhm.
really, you know, that we've talked about. So with that comes a little bit of decorum, of course, because a lot of these companies and people are still in the game. Um, so one of the things that I wanted to start out with is can we talk a little bit about like the early entry point? So I know that you had started out by kind of being an outside consultant and just suggesting things. Like you had an idea for Emu, right?
Mhm.
And how that parlayed into working with Akai. Let's start there.
Yeah, there were a number of things that sort of interacted, separate things that sort of came together. Um, one of the, and this was not the big motivation, but it turned out to be an important element. Um, there was a certain amount of flailing around trying to figure out where we're going once creative took over. I have to say there's, and I think we said this back on the other show, there's kind of some people have an idea that, you know, creative came in, they only wanted the technology and they sort of ruined EMU. And that's not at all the case. Creative was actually incredibly supportive of EMU and the music stuff. But there was a question about what direction to go in. I mean, clearly we were the sampling people, but also digital recording was happening, and there were a lot of directions that were being looked at. And I specifically was looking, among other things, at what the SP1200 had told us. That had been my product in terms of product management and user interface design and that sort of thing. And we had all watched about how it had become adopted by the rap hip hop world. And it was clear it was pretty expensive, so it was pretty much limited to the artists or people who just had a lot of money. But there were obviously a lot of hobbyists and semi-pros who wanted that capability. So one of the things I was proposing at the time was a follow-on to the SP1200, using some sound engine technology we had coming up that would allow it to be somewhat less expensive. So I had made a number of proposals for such a product, but they never got taken up. It kind of just got lost in the I don't want to say flailing around, but you know, all the various directions people were looking in. So that was in the back of my mind. The other issue, and this was more when I really decided it was time to move on, a friend of mine at E-MU, Neil Richard, who was our salesperson, had been contacted through our Japanese distributor to offer some advice to Akai. They were looking to increase their kind of marketing and sales position in the United States. They had a representative company here, IMC, International Music Corporation, in Fort Worth, that represented them. But they had a suspicion that they could add marketing or whatever to have a higher presence in the country. And Neil was offering them some advice, and he came to me and asked me about, he was handling the sales stuff, he was a sales guy, came to me and asked me if I could contribute some advice on the marketing side. And I said, yeah, I could. And we collaboratively put together a proposal, not a proposal for ourselves, but just a proposal to, just a strategic proposal for what they might do to accomplish that in the United States. And they received that very positively and basically made me an offer to come and help them execute it. And I accepted because, as I say, I realized it was really time to move on. So I put together a company here in the United States. They didn't want to hire me directly as an employee, I guess, for international tax purposes or whatever. So I created a consulting company, and they were my exclusive contract. And that was basically the start of my association with them.
So let's kind of roll back just a little bit to what you were saying about you had an idea for what you could do with, I believe what it was at the time it would have been the G chip, right?
G chip, right.
So at this time,
although I think actually the H chip was coming by that time too, so it could have. I mean, there's a lot of talk about what the actual engine would have been, but the G chip.
But this was what was giving the ideas of like, hey, we have more power that we can use at it, and do things in an affordable way.
Yeah.
But at that point, Dave was doing the creative stuff, like
Primarily.
Yeah. So, what was it like for you, where it was like you were used to working so close together, and now it felt like things were kind of broken apart? Was that really frustrating, or like what was that? What was the feeling?
Yeah, there was some frustration. Luckily, I had what I felt was a really good relationship with the engineers. E-MU had a brilliant team of engineers, and I'd been working with them for years. And different engineers work on different products, and depending on what the product was, I'd have very close relationships with the engineers that were working on those particular products. So, clearly, not working with Dave as much as I used to was unfortunate, but it was just the reality of the situation. But I still had good relationships with the engineers. But the engineers weren't the ones making the decisions, and that was kind of where the problem was. There had been a lot of I don't want to say conflict, but a lot of different directions that marketing was being pulled in by different people. And it was more trying to get your product in the marketing stream under the new generation of management. And so it was frustrating. It wasn't anger making. It was like there were a lot of products that were possibilities, and we had to evaluate them all. And if mine didn't come to the top, it didn't come to the top. If this, I wouldn't say mine, obviously I was working on a lot of other products. But if this particular one didn't come to the top, that was kind of the way it was. I was putting a lot of time on Morpheus. Morpheus was also my product during that time. And that was also a very exciting product, but not as successful as it would have been for a lot of reasons, but nonetheless also taking up a lot of the time. So, but there was some frustration. I had a very clear picture that there was this market waiting for an affordable version of an SP, or an MPC. Wasn't really looking in that direction at the time, but one of the two. Those were the two products that were the archetypes of that product description.
So then you have this idea. You're like, okay, we can do something affordable. You present it to Akai. Akai likes the idea. And in that proposal is kind of, hey, you need somebody to kind of take this forward. Like you need somebody who understands the business to really take it from an idea of this is what a product idea is and make it into a product path. Right?
Well, that came later. Actually, the product proposal wasn't part of the initial proposal that led to my association with them. The product, that proposal was more strategic about the organization of their presence in the United States, their marketing, how they could ramp up their marketing in the United States. It was really more organizational than it was product oriented. It was once I got to Akai, once I became a part, and I started taking place in product planning meetings and that sort of thing, that my very first proposal was the idea that I brought over from E-MU, which is, okay, you guys have the MPC 3000. It's an iconic product. And it's created this umbrella where there's an enormous, in my view, an enormous demand in the market by people who can't afford the flagship. And that market is substantially larger than the flagship market, I believed. And they were initially reticent because the first thought was, well, this is a flagship product for us, and this will somehow cannibalize it. It's somehow going to eat away at it or affect its people are going to buy the cheaper one instead of the expensive one. And my response was, no, I don't really think so. I mean, given the market this appeals to, where the 3000 is such an iconic product, that I don't see someone in that market, in the rap hip hop market, who could afford a 3000 saying, I'm not going to buy a 3000, I'm going to buy a 2000 again because it's cheaper. I mean, I think there's, a certain amount of prestige that comes from owning the flagship.
Flagship, yeah.
So there were a lot of discussions about that, but I think part of it was, I was in the honeymoon phase there. They had hired me specifically to be a strategic marketing consultant. They were paying me money to provide them with my opinion of what good strategic marketing would be. And my first advice was this product. And I was really passionate about it. I was really pushing it. And I think maybe for no other reason than they felt, well, we can't say no to this first thing. So they said yes, and that started it was originally going to be called the MPC 1000, but then it became the MPC 2000 before it was launched, because we realized it would probably eventually be even less expensive versions. So we had to give ourselves some room under there, name-wise. Plus the sampler, the affordable sampler, had been the S2000, so 2000 was sort of the branding of less expensive but still high quality. And that started a multi-year development process, which I have to say it was a wonderfully smooth process. It wasn't the process I was used to, because obviously having worked at E-MU, right down the hall from everybody building this, anytime I had an idea or a question or whatever, it was like 10 footsteps to sit down with the engineer or whatever. And there was a lot of debate. And this was all being done in Japan. Akai had multiple development teams. They had a team in the UK, a brilliant team in the UK, that primarily worked on the samplers and the post-production stuff. But the MPC was a Japanese project, so we're dealing with the team in Japan. So for the next 2 years, 18 months, I actually don't remember. I'd have to go back and look at old notebooks. The MPC 2000 project moved really smoothly through the process. There was a lot of back and forth about details. I mean, clearly, we weren't designing something from scratch. It was clearly based on the 3000, which had been primarily Roger's work. And the question was, how can we take the best of this and put it in a form that makes it more affordable? Obviously, there were going to be some things that had to be jettisoned, but we didn't want to jettison anything that really compromised the overall functionality and user experience of the product. And that process worked wonderfully. I've got to say, it's one of the most delightful projects I've worked on. And at the end of that, it came out and was a huge success. I believe that it was the single biggest product launch in terms of sales in the Akai EMI history. So that also, gave me a vote of confidence for suggesting future products. But
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So this would have been just to kind of roll up what was kind of going on at the time. So we're in an age where the internet's not really fully going, full blast at that point. It's really kind of on the cusp.
Mhm.
And you're dealing with engineering, which is based in Japan. So
Mhm.
this is primarily over fax, right?
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
so Roger Linn had been out at this time, like he was no longer dealing with Akai at this point.
Mhm.
And while you're doing all this, what was the sentiment about, continuing the MPC range and, continuing to work on these products, knowing that, okay, the lead designer from before is now gone, and how did that play into things?
Well, Roger had left before I arrived, and I actually didn't know much about how that developed at the time. I mean, Roger and I had been friends for a long time, but kind of seeing each other at shows. But ironically enough, during the years in which my Akai office was in the town of Aptos, a little town south of Santa Cruz, where I lived, Roger was living in Santa Cruz in those years. So we were actually meeting for coffee quite often, talking over things. More personal things, more things, about the world in general, the music world in general, not really diving deep into Akai stuff. When I arrived, I didn't get any sense within the company. I didn't get any sense within the company at all about their attitudes about Roger's presence or lack of presence there. I guess the people in Japan who were developing it had whatever expertise they had and able to do it. They'd already designed in collaboration with Roger the MPC 3000, and the development just went forward with very little personal reference to Roger at all. The interesting thing, and I don't think this is widely known, at the end of the process, shortly before we were going to release the product at NAMM, Roger, or a representative of Roger, I don't know which, because I wasn't in the middle of that, contacted Akai and told them that they were going to owe him royalties for the MPC 2000. And I guess they were not under the impression that they were going to. It was quite a surprise from what I could tell. And I did get a message from Japan telling me that this had happened and sending me a copy of the contract that Roger had with Akai way back when he was working with them. I guess the initial contract under which he had, I don't know whether he worked for them. I'm sure it was a consulting contract, but and they asked me to go find a lawyer in contract law and IP law who would give their advice about whether Roger had a claim to this. And I remember reading the contract just out of curiosity. I'm not a lawyer. I have no particular expertise in the gobbledygook of legal nomenclature. But I remember reading this and thinking off the top of my head, wow, this sure sounds like they owe Roger royalties on this. I don't remember the exact details, but it kind of basically said something along the lines of any future products that made use of anything that had been developed in the collaboration, they owed him royalties on. So I found a lawyer, sent it off to the lawyer. The lawyer spent a couple of weeks reading it, drafted a report that basically said that you guys owe him the money. I sent it back to Japan. They were not happy, and Tommy Moore, who was the president of IMC, the distributor in Texas, was convinced that I just hadn't gone to a powerful enough lawyer, and had me send the contract to him, and he found what I guess he felt was a more powerful lawyer there in Texas who came back and told him the same things. So as far as I know, Roger profited from the
Roger made his money.
Roger made his money, and honestly, as an Akai employee, I had a certain level of loyalty to Akai, trying to do the best for them. But as a close friend of Roger, I actually couldn't be happier.
Sure, yeah.
Ended up made a bunch of money. So yeah, I think that I got to say it worked out well for everybody, because frankly, the product would not have been the success it was without Roger having designed the basis that it was based on, and it wouldn't have been out there if Akai hadn't engineered a low-cost version, and it was a huge success. So everybody won.
So I'm gonna skip a little bit forward, but I'm also gonna come back this to closer to this era. But I want to stick to kind of this product lineage right here for a second. So you did this and you continued to market it, and I'll pull up. This is part of your marketing here. Would have been the brochures, handling things like the trade shows, getting people on board.
Websites and stuff.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about what the adoption to this was like, and what you dealt with as far as challenges to make sure that this became the hit that it was.
Well, it's interesting because the first task was that Akai had no real, they were not aware whatsoever of what was happening in the world of media and the internet. I mean, I joined in 94, mid 94. The web was like 2 years old at that point. It had really been only in the last year or so that anybody outside of the sort of arcane tech world had become aware of it. But websites were beginning to be created, not a lot, but it was clear to me that we need part of establishing our brand, not only in the United States, but worldwide, was to try to be ahead of the media curve. And I'd made a big pitch to them about getting a web presence. And it was kind of hard because they weren't even doing email at that point. It was the team in the UK did email over, I can't remember what it was called. It was something like, it wasn't CompuServe, but it was one of those like private, internet email things. CIX or something like that. I don't know.
Anyway, there was a ton of them at that time.
There was a ton. So the
Prodigy
UK,
and all that stuff.
yeah, in the UK people were communicating by email, but with Akai Japan, it was entirely fax. So they weren't even too aware of what this was about and why they should do it. But again, I made a really strong pitch, and I said, you need a website, and I'll develop it. And they said, okay, we're not quite sure what this is about, but we'll let you do it. Actually, another kind of funny story is the first task was, of course, since they had no interest or knowledge of this, they didn't have a domain, and they hadn't gone and looked and see whether it was an Akai.com to be able to get. So I immediately looked for a domain. I looked for Akai.com and found that it was taken. And it was taken by some company in the Midwest of the United States. And we were just beginning to hear about people that were, squatting on internet domains of large company names in hopes that they could then hold them for ransom and sell them for big bucks. And I was kind of afraid that that was what had happened here. Because, I mean, the Akai was a large company. The music division wasn't particularly, but Akai as a, consumer electronics company is a fairly large company. But I just picked up the phone and called the people in the Midwest who had registered Akai.com and got these really friendly guys. They were a marketing company that did web development, and they represented some company, and I can't remember exactly. I think it may have been Applied Kinetic Artificial Intelligence. So when they...
Goodness.
Yeah.
Don't get on their bad side.
Yeah. So when they went to get a domain, they didn't want it to be Applied Kinetic Artificial Intelligence.com, so they made it Akai.com. And I explained to them who we were and what we wanted to do. And they said, oh, sorry, sure, if you'll reimburse us for the money it took us to register it, we'll just transfer it to you. And it was
man.
It's like, whoa. Oh, and one of our guys is a musician. Can we get a discount on a DR4 recorder? It's like, yeah, certainly. You bet you can. I mean, I'm thinking if this had been 6 months later, there would have been people asking, $500,000 for it, or if these people had been bigger jerks. But nice guys who went, oh, we understand, sure. I think it took us $100, so just send us $100 and you can have it. I don't think that would happen today. So anyway, we got the domain name, and we built a website. And when it came time to launch the MPC, we were able to launch it on a website, which was not a common thing in those days. And we weren't really doing email marketing at that time, I have to say. It was before a lot of it was before a lot of email marketing, quite frankly. There weren't all the various organizations or services you could sign up to do mass email marketing. So a lot of marketing at that time was still done through the music press, the magazines. The the writing was kind of beginning to be on the wall, where the magazines were going to, their days were numbered really in efficacy. But at that point, they were still fairly the place that people found out more details. And, after all those years at E-MU, I was happy to say that I had a really good relationship with all the people at Keyboard and all the people at EM. And there were some other Musician magazine, great magazine, that unfortunately long gone, but a great magazine.
Sure.
And, Sound on Sound and the rest of them. So we got great coverage there. We introduced it, I believe, at a NAMM show. So we got the NAMM coverage. And IMC, to their credit, had a fair amount of artist relation chops. So they were able to get it into the hands of some well-known people as well. And in those days, brochures were still a thing. I don't know the last time I saw a paper brochure or anything, or made a paper. I mean, I can't count all of the paper brochures I designed over the years.
Sure.
Not in decades.
So these brochures, were you also handling things like getting artist management involved, and trying to figure out who, you had in your head who it was that needed this product, but then you had to also make sure that you got artists on board and, to help promote the thing. I can remember during this era, I mean, I would scour like you were saying about the magazines, I would scour the back of like Future Music magazine and whatnot and just look at the prices and just start drooling about this thing, which at the time it was, considered a whole lot more affordable than the previous generation, but we're still talking about a decent amount of money for a sampler.
Yeah.
Which at the time it like I said, I mean, it was way more affordable than the previous stuff, but still, we're still talking, I want to say maybe $2,000, something like that, somewhere in that range.
I think the 2000 launched at $1,500, $1,499. Okay. I think its price went up a little during its life. I'm not sure of that, but I believe it launched at $1,495.
So yeah, we're talking $1,500. So not a $300 guitar, but at the same time, So what was some of the challenges involved as far as getting like artists involved and that sort of thing, to where it was like you needed it to be adopted in that way? Was it just a quick adoption thing and you were just like, okay, we got the ball rolling, or how did that go for you?
It was a quick adoption thing. I didn't specifically do artist relations on that I relied on the folks at IMC for that, because they had already some strong long-standing relationships through their marketing of the original MPC and the samplers. What I saw, and which was a delight for me, is that there was such a vacuum of desire for it that once it was there, the initial sales were just really quite extraordinary. It was much stronger than even I had expected. It was certainly stronger than Akai had expected. People had been reading about SPs and MPCs and reading about how the artists that they admired were using them. And there were articles about it. You could read about how a particular article had used an MPC on this album or on this cut or whatever, and the sampling tricks and all that sort of stuff. There were, I think, articles in magazines about that. So people were ready to do it. They just couldn't afford it. So when suddenly they could afford it, or at least a substantial number of people could afford it, they rushed in for it. It wasn't a build where they were waiting, does this get the seal of approval from this artist or that artist? It kind of had the seal of approval because it was an MPC, and it looked a lot like a baby 3000. And not that baby. I mean, you just look at them and it's clear that they're versions of exactly the same thing. So, no, I'm happy.
And you had some influence on how the actual design layout ended up as well.
Yeah, I did. I had a very close iterative discussion with the engineers through the entire process. Clearly we knew it was going to look in its basic subsections like an MPC 3000. There was going to be, a grid of pads. There was going to be the display. There were going to be transport buttons. There was going to be a slider that you could assign to things. So it wasn't like we were designing the user interface from scratch. We were really translating the user interface to a somewhat more affordable form factor. I think, as I mentioned to you when we were talking the other day, in terms of just user interface and industrial design, the one place I put my foot down is that slider in the lower left that's assignable used to be, I mean, let me look at it myself. I have to move my screen here for a second. It used to be right over there to the left of the pad matrix. And it just put it in a place where you were reaching across the transports, and if you were hitting the pads and putting your hand there, and I just felt really strongly that if you were playing with your right hand and controlling with your left hand, having them separated like that and not having to have other buttons under your palm while you manipulated that slider was really important. And that was probably, I don't say there were arguments about it. There were certainly debates about it, but I think it was the one user experience thing that I stood my ground on, and there it is over on the left-hand side.
Well, to this day, I still try to yell at Akai and say that this is the layout. This is the preferred layout in my opinion. Having the the pads on the right, transport down there, faders on the left. That to me is like the best. That's the best MPC layout in my opinion. I absolutely love that layout. How did this progress? So this becomes a huge hit, right?
Mhm.
And then it becomes a situation where you guys had a follow-up, the 2000 XL,
Mhm.
and also there was rack mount samplers being in the works as well. Now they were
Mhm.
being developed over in the UK, is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. When I came in '94, they were already in the early development process. Um, and it was quite a process. I mean, those products were incredibly complex. It was an enormous development process, and then the physical thing of having the removable control panel from the larger of the two and the like. So there were industrial design issues there. It's like I arrived in mid '94, and those samplers were literally announced on the day I left in '98. They showed up. It was the same day that I basically designed two generations of website for Akai. That early one, shortly after I came, and then we worked on a redesign that launched literally on the day I left the company, and it included the announcement and introduction of the S5000, S6000.
So what were some of the challenges working with a primarily Japanese team, and you were communicating with them via fax and not really having like a quick back and forth discussion? And was there a language barrier? And was there any issues with as far as like how you wanted to promote this stuff and move this brand forward versus what they saw and versus what maybe even like the UK saw?
I'm happy to say that there wasn't a lot. Clearly, the biggest thing that I would say was a challenge is that the lack of immediacy in communication. As I said earlier, I had 15 years of experience of being able to walk next door and talk to the engineer making anything, or walk next door to the manufacturing person or the person doing the industrial design, and have conversations, numerous times a day whenever a thought entered my mind that needed to be discussed, or whether I needed to respond to something that had happened. And as you say, with when things were being developed in Japan, there was always at least a one-day turnaround where we would send a fax on one day and hope to come in the next morning and find a response. But they were responsive. I mean, I will say it was a great team in Japan. Language was really not a problem. And it was all because of them, not me. I spoke virtually no Japanese, but the people I talked to and the people that I interfaced with had very good English. I mean, there were occasionally a time when I'd have to clarify something technical that I couldn't quite figure out. But for the most part, the people I communicated with, they were both representatives of the engineering department there, and their own marketing and salespeople were really good, great people. I mean, I have to say, I enjoyed interfacing with all of them. Obviously, I didn't get to be as close friends with as many of them as I would if, we were all, a few offices down. But, I visited Japan often multiple times a year, usually for a week or so at a time, and traveled with a lot of those people as well. So I had really great relationships with them. And when those faxes came in and there was a name on it, I knew exactly, who I was communicating with and what they were like. And it was a great experience, I have to say.
So, and this is all, I mean, your experience of previously having worked so closely with Dave Rossum, you had it was a small company at E-MU, and you were used to kind of being hands-on and back and forth, and though not being an engineer,
Mhm,
being partaking in the engineering side of things.
mhm.
Was that something that was kind of a change for you over at Akai, and how did you kind of come to grips with that whole side of things?
It was definitely a change because I didn't have my head in the engineering stuff as much as I did at E-MU. I mean, I think I've always felt in my career one of I hope my strengths at least is that I had good relationships with engineers because I'm typically able to talk to them on their level, not the nitty gritty nuts and bolts technical level, but the basic principles of the technology we're talking about is something I make a point of trying to be as conversant with as I can. And that always made those conversations actually, generally comfortable unless we were butting heads about something, which often happened. Not often happened, I shouldn't say often, but did occasionally happen. So I didn't have that same level of getting in the trenches with the Akai engineers, and that I actually didn't know most of the engineers who were on, the day-to-day line writing the code and doing that. I was dealing with engineering managers and marketing people, and and for the most part, it was great. Not every suggestion I made was accepted. A lot of them were, a few of them weren't, and when they weren't, it was explained to me why they thought they should go in a different direction. I was, quite responsive to that. From a marketing point of view, I had a very I was really free to go my own way. I have to say, I really appreciate the extent to which they valued my insight on marketing stuff. I don't remember really ever getting into any kind of conflicts. Obviously, I didn't have almost anything to do with marketing in Japan. I mean, Japan is a very unique market. The distribution there is very unique. The marketing is very unique. And they handled all that themselves. The marketing that I was doing was for both the United States and for the rest of the world. A lot of the brochures I did were distributed worldwide or translated by the various other distributors. But I have to say, I could not have been happier with the freedom I was given from a marketing and promotion point of view, and the support I was given for all of what some of them I think thought were the wacky ideas I brought in. Certainly when things about the internet when they weren't aware of the internet.
So you also had a hand in the Akai DPS12, and I bring that up. That was actually one of my first multi-track recorders,
Mhm.
and I used the heck out of that thing, and fought through the jazz discs and
Yeah.
but that machine was, came at a really special time where it was like before that, it was mostly all like Tascam Porta Studios on tape and that
Mhm.
sort of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about that product and what that was like to launch something, kind of radical in that space?
Well, that was, if I look at my 4 years there, I had my hands in a bunch of products, but the two that I really kind of consider as my product was the MPC 2000 and the DPS12. And that the DPS12 came from asking for briefings about their digital recording technology. I mean, they had the DR4 um, when I came, and a DR8. They had the DR4 and the DR8, which were their sort of bulletproof standalone dedicated digital recorders. And we were in those years were really years of transition between dedicated hardware for digital recording and computer-based digital recording. And both of those, we were at a point where both of them were kind of being developed simultaneously before um, the computer stuff really started taking over. But talking about, we were looking at the sort of the prototype competition was the Roland 880. What was there? They had an eight channel one of these. I forget what it was.
Yeah, they had the VS 880.
Yeah,
and 890 as well.
Yeah, and the 880 was 8 channel, and it was compressed audio. And one of the things that had become clear in my communication, with the Akai people about their digital recording technology, is that we had the ability we could do 12 channels, and we could do it uncompressed. And can you scroll back up to the top? It's been so long since I saw that.
Sure.
Yeah. So we could set ourselves up. I mean, the Roland had been a big hit. I mean, they had sold a ton of them. And what we felt we had was something that could trumpet on the number of channels and could trumpet on sound quality, because we were doing uncompressed audio. And that was the idea. And so I started basically brainstorming with the engineers and their marketing people about what we could do. What would a dedicated, self-contained digital recorder mixer taking advantage of our current technology, with the basic parameter being 12 channels and uncompressed audio, look like? And this was it. And I felt that this would be a very competitive product in that market, and it would be consistent with the brand image that Akai had. They already had a presence in standalone digital recording, but they were very special in that they were just the recorders.
Yeah, and this was I actually bought one of these before I got my MPC. I think I was actually, now that I'm thinking on it, I
Mhm.
want to say with that I was often using like an MP7,
Oh,
the E-MU MP7, and made a lot of terrible music with both, and some stuff that I still cherish. I actually still have all my jazz discs from that.
uh,
Who knows how I'll ever get that get
yeah,
get
really.
any of that media off of there, but I
Yeah,
still have that stuff to this day, and it's just great fun remembering,
yeah,
sitting that thing on a dresser and going to town on it, and it was, the sound quality was definitely, like, a massive difference. I mean,
yeah.
it's coming from that, and again, we had, the guitarist that I was with at the time had, I wanna say he had an 880 or 890, I can't remember which it was. I think we had both at one point, and yeah, it was a night and day difference. The main thing that was different to us, I remember going back and forth between them, was also the effects was very different between the 2. The Rowan had some great effects, but the recording quality on the Akai was leaps and bounds better.
Mhm.
So you also had, worked with, releasing the S5000 as well.
Just at the very beginning of it, as I say,
Mhm.
I communicated with the UK team that were developing it, but they were well into that before I even came to the company. And clearly the sort of the user interface paradigm for samplers was very different between the E-MU ones and the Akai ones, and it of course made total sense that the new samplers would be consistent with the Akai user interface. Um, I had some suggestions here and there, but for the most part, they really had a good grip on what they were doing and what it had to be. I suggested a few things. Some, again, as usual, some were accepted, some not so much. And I know it had been, it was supposed to come out sooner than it did, but I mean, everything is supposed to come out sooner than it does. And as it happened, it launched the day I left the company. So as far as my launching the product, it really kind of came down to creating the web page for it and writing the stuff around it and having it launch on our new website the day I left. So after that, I can't say I was super involved in that. I had a modest involvement during the development time and almost no involvement with the eventual marketing beyond that launch.
So just touching back on the idea of you kind of bouncing between different companies at this time where you're really the music tech side of things is really kind of exploding and becoming this whole new platform really because
Mhm,
for the better part of the 90s a lot of the digital technology was evolving really fast. Did
mhm.
you find that something that was kind of like a challenge to keep the users up to date and you had the magazine articles and whatnot, but when it came to face at trade shows and that sort of thing, what was it like to get people educated about this sort of stuff?
Um, there wasn't a lot of dedicated education. I mean, this was before YouTube and people doing demos and that kind of demo. Um, Luckily, I think a lot of the stuff we did at Akai was, I don't know, say almost self-evident functionally. I mean, there are some products that are really arcane and you're not quite sure what they do, and you have to become sort of intimately familiar with them before you find out what the quirks are and what it accomplishes. One of the things about the Akai products, at least the ones I were involved with, is it was really straightforward what they were. They weren't hard to understand. The samplers were samplers. They were in the, they were, you know, um, development from samplers people were already familiar with. It did the same thing samplers did. It kind of did more of it. There were a lot more channels, a lot more memory. Nice big displays. But in terms of getting people to the point where they needed to decide whether they wanted to have one or not, that wasn't really difficult because the kind of the bullet points of what made a 5,000 or 6,000, what it was, were really pretty easy to understand. The MPC was an MPC. It didn't have a lot of secret arcane things hidden away in it. It's like, this is what it is. And if this is what you need, you're going to know that this is what you need.
Well,
I
that was
think,
one of those things where it became kind of like legend in the industry where it was like these manuals they were interesting because they weren't terribly written, but at the same time, they were definitely technically written.
yeah.
So it was a thing where you had things. I remember Master Ace had an album called Disposable Arts, and there's a skit in there where essentially rappers and producers are going away to like this camp to learn how to be rappers and producers, and they're like, welcome to MPC 101 and here's the manual. Like you have to go through this whole thing. So it really was at that time that's kind of how the feeling was, where it was this, yeah, you had to read the manual and you had to put the hours in to just kind of like learn something, and it, if you were lucky, you knew somebody around you who already had worked on something like that. But a
Mhm.
lot of people weren't really even sharing their techniques with other people. So it
Yeah.
was kind of it was an interesting time because it was like you really had to dedicate to it. It wasn't like, oh, how do I truncate, and then just type in YouTube MPC, how do I truncate, and
Yeah.
the videos right there,
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things, one of the things that I am proud of, and back in the day, was it's always been my feeling that if you can create something complicated that doesn't need a manual, that's sort of the ultimate goal in terms of user experience. And I was the one who at E-MU created the user interface for the emulator 2, where we basically put manual chapter headings on the front panel. So you could find exactly, if you want to know how to truncate, you looked at the front panel till you saw the module with truncated and pulled that up and did it. And I took that over to the SP12 and SP1200, and I think that's one of the things about that. And if you look at the new SP1200 today, it's still essentially the manual is kind of there on the front panel. Um, it obviously doesn't work for everything, but
Congratulations on that, by the way. So
thank
new release of the SP1200
you. Yeah,
with some updates on there and a new chassis and all that good stuff.
really proud of that. And it looks like it's been well received, so we're happy with that. At any
Excellent.
rate, the biggest challenge I think in terms of the development of technology in the 90s was knowing where things were going to end up? I mean, one of the things about the DPS12, which is a product that I'm as proud of that as I am the MPC 2000, but it was not nearly as big a success. And one of the things was it was in a time of transition where people were not quite sure what they should be looking at for digital recording. The computer digital recording systems were becoming more and more powerful as the computers were, as hard disks got bigger, as memory got cheaper, all that sort of thing. And, and the DAWs got more powerful. And it was beginning to look like hardware stuff might actually be a limitation where, with a software-based stuff, you could get your product could be an entirely new product next year, depending on what new software got released. But with a hardware box, you're limited to what can be modified in a very specific hardware box. And I think the DPS12 came out at a time where the transition was just beginning to move away from dedicated hardware as the optimum way. I mean, we had ADATs and the Roland 880s and that sort of stuff. And I know the bottom fell out of it. I know Roland sold, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of those things, and then sort of the bottom fell out of it a few years later, because when I was at Antares, we undertook a collaborative project with Roland to make Autotune available on the 880. And it didn't turn into a great product because it took a while to do. I mean, we were dealing with incredible limitations on the hardware that wasn't designed for that. And by the time it was out, they wanted to sell that as an add-on. And in the meantime, the sales of the 880 essentially cratered. We were all excited. Oh my God, they're selling hundreds of thousands of these. And by the time the Autotune for the 880 was actually available, they weren't selling a lot of 880s at all, quite frankly. So another thing that got caught in that transition. But yeah, so I think the issue was people weren't quite sure what direction things were going during that time. Hardware was strong, software was strong, but if you looked really closely at it, software was getting a lot stronger, a lot faster than hardware was. And the limitations of hardware were becoming more obvious as you saw the incredible flexibility that software offered. So that unfortunately was the environment in which the DPS12 is. It's not sad it wasn't a failure, it was a successful product, but
just in relation to
if it had been a couple years earlier, I think it would have been a lot more successful. But time marches on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about, in the span of probably 5 years, you had just a complete shift in how people were recording and doing everything. I mean, you had the whole of Pro Tools was being able to come to, I want to say the M box was like right around the corner too.
Yeah.
So that was pretty massive at that point.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's great history to look at. I mean, during the 80s was all about the transition in sampling, and in the 90s is all about the transition in recording. So those were dynamic years. I mean, they were exciting years to be in that industry. There was certainly an exciting time for me to have my career there because there was never any lack of exciting things to react to and respond to and develop to. So those were my two big products. I had stuff to do. There were follow-on for some products that I don't think ever came out. Akai had a really odd little product called the Remix 16. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there was going to be a much bigger remix thing came out, and that got lost. And I mean, the story, we haven't touched on this, but the other thing that happened during the years I was at Akai was that the company got sold. And it didn't really have anything much to do with the musical instrument division, which was the profitable hunk of Akai. It was at the consumer products part, which was the majority of Akai, had been in a lot of trouble for a long time. And their financial, I believe, don't quote me on this, it's been too long, I used to know this, but I think they had a financial relationship with Mitsubishi Bank or something like that because of friendship between the Akai and Mitsubishi families or something like that. Anyway, they've been kind of propped up for a while. And then it was decided they couldn't be propped up anymore. And they were sold to a Hong Kong company called Semitech Global Limited. And they were based in Hong Kong, and they basically wanted the company for the consumer product name. They had the whole story of their company was that they had bought Singer sewing machine, I guess, out of bankruptcy or trouble or something, and used the name to open Singer sewing machine stores in emerging countries around the world, where people, the society was coming from a point where, okay, we have enough money to buy food and a place to live. Now we want to buy something to be able to make our own clothes. And they were hugely successful with this. And I guess their strategy was, okay, now that people have sewing machines, the next thing they need is VCRs. So let's find a name that we can put on VCRs and sell them. And Akai was in trouble, and they bought Akai, and that was basically why they did it. They weren't particularly interested in the musical instrument division. That wasn't part of their overall business strategy, but they were happy to have it continue to function because it was the profitable part of the business. And that led to all kinds of interesting political issues between the various people who wanted to gain power. Once Semitech was there was Semitech itself. James Ting was the owner of Semitech in Hong Kong. There were the people from Japan, who were, the part of the actual electronic music division of Akai. And then there was Tommy Moore and his people in Texas at INC who wanted to be a part of that. So there was a lot of jockeying for power during those years. That's also when I kind of saw that the writing was on the wall, I think, for continuing my career there. We were looking at, I think, at eventually, before the sale, I didn't know anything about the financial, condition of the company when I came on. I assumed that I would just be working for the company as it was. And there was a thought that the real way forward in the United States was to create a wholly owned American subsidiary, essentially an Akai US, which there wasn't at the time. But it became clear that once Akai was sold and went to Semitech, they didn't really have any interest in creating such a thing. And that put me in a position of having come to do one thing and having that thing sort of disappear. So that was pretty much why.
That's always scary.
It was scary. They came to me, I had my office, in addition to being the strategic marketing company, I had something called the Akai EMI US R&D Center, where I had people that I'd actually hired to work not on R&D. They weren't engineers, but more on product concept research and that sort of thing. So I had a couple of really bright young men that I had hired out of Cogswell College, which was a college here in the Bay Area that had professional music career programs and the like. A couple of really bright guys. But then they decided to close that down because clearly we were not going to establish an Akai US. And then they wanted to set me up with a advertising agency, my own advertising agency, to do their advertising. And I said, no, that's not really me. My interests are much wider than, yes, I do advertising, but I'm much wider than just that. So that's what eventually led me to Akai, or to Antares. But the other issue that really impacted their product development during those last couple of years that I was there after the DPS, and I don't know how many people know the story. It's really a fascinating story. I'm surprised actually somebody hasn't done a TV series about it. But in 97, maybe, EDS, the company in Texas, it was Ross Perot's company, came to Akai, and actually came to quite a few big consumer electronic companies, Pioneer and Sony and a number of other people, with what was supposed to be a very top secret Nato project to develop a kind of a cutting edge digital, I don't know, I'm trying to remember the description of it, a real-time battlefield data management system or something like that. And they wanted to see if they could create this thing out of the core of existing technology rather than developing it all from scratch. And they told Akai that because they had this digital recording technology, particularly the DR4 and the DR8, and these things were just like bulletproof standalone digital recorders. They were really amazing. We were candidates for being put into this deep, dark, secret, black ops, super secret program. We had to sign NDAs and all that. and they asked us to send a lot of our gear to NATO in Belgium for evaluation and destruction testing and all that. And if the contract was supposed to be worth many millions of dollars. Eventually, the contract was supposed to be worth like $750 million. So this seemed like a great opportunity. And I wasn't directly involved in this, but I had in my office in Aptos, I had a complete set of all Akai products. And I kept getting these requests to box things up and send them to Belgium, to NATO, so that they could evaluate them. And I remember when they asked me to do that with an MPC 2000, I remember mentioning to one of my friends, boy, somebody at NATO is obviously putting together a really nice recording studio. And then they started getting news back that they really liked our stuff, but they needed changes made. They wanted both hardware and software modifications to the products. And so they took a lot of the engineering capability we had, which was never in great supply. I mean, it was always a precious resource, and put it towards modifying these products to meet the needs of this secret NATO product. And this was in process when I left the company in '98. And I'd run into my Akai friends at NAMM shows, and one of the first questions I'd ask is, whoa, how is that NATO project going? And I remember the first year it was like, it's going great. You know, we've made a lot of progress, and we've heard from Tommy Moore's connections in Washington that we're on the fast track to getting this contract. It's going to be $750 million. And it was like, wow, congratulations, that's awesome. And then the next year at NAMM, I went to my friends and said, well, how is the NATO project coming? And I got these big, long faces. And they said, oh, haven't you heard? And I said, no, I haven't. The entire thing was a scam. There never was a NATO project. There was one guy in an apartment in Belgium who created a persona for himself of being an Air Force captain or general or something, scammed EDS, convinced them he was NATO, got hundreds of millions of dollars of high-tech equipment from Akai, from Pioneer, from Sony, from presumably many others, and disappeared. And
it sounds like he may have even gotten some firmware updates.
Yeah, well, what he was going to do
was basically feature requesting for the gear that he got. He's like, oh, I really wish you could do this.
Yeah, I don't know what he would ever do with that firmware, actually. You know, I seem to remember reading in one of the articles that when Sony...
That's what I should have done, man. There's so... Yeah. I'm thinking about it now. I'm like, there's so many firmware updates. If I had just told them I was a government contractor.
Right. Sony eventually got suspicious and sent an investigator to what was supposed to be the NATO research lab and discovered it was an apartment in a suburb of Belgium, and found like 40 big flat screen TVs still in their box with like bird poop all over them out in the backyard, and rooms full of high-tech stuff. And
well, that's weird. That
yeah, wasn't even clear. Yeah, wasn't even clear what the goal was. And the guy lived there. He had married somebody local, and then it turned out he had another wife somewhere else. And his persona was some other person in the United States whose name he had. I mean, there were a couple of... Wall Street Journal did a brilliant story about this that's hysterical to read. And if anybody's interested, I'll give you the link, and you can put it down in the description here or something.
Sure, yeah. You'll have to send me the link later.
It's an amazing and hysterical story. But the sad thing is, I mean, it's also tragic in that, you know, I don't know what Akai could have developed during those critical years after, you know, Sovietek Global had acquired them if they hadn't been spending so much time and energy on something that turned out to be a complete chimera. I mean, it was just...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's something where it's like you said, I mean, it's a very finite supply when you're talking about developing music tech. So when you take up that time, it's like that whole period, you know, and when you're talking about a contract that size, you're putting your best people on it. You know, you're really trying to secure something like that. So yeah, that really, I'm sure, completely altered the path of what that music tech scene was during that time, not just for Akai, but for multiple people.
Yeah, multiple, and it wasn't just the music scene. I mean, it was people were, you know, there were video stuff and, high-end professional video stuff from people like Pioneer and Sony and that sort of stuff. I mean, it was like an incredible thing. I mean, it's just an almost unbelievable story.
Scams really alter the world. I mean, there was a massive scam that went down in China not all that long ago in the chip tech world where, basically billions were scammed away because, it was a bunch of high school dropouts had convinced them that they were these high level engineers. And yeah, that's a fascinating story in and of itself. And
it's amazing what happens when you wave large amounts of money in people.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So,
apparently the other thing is that it could have been stopped so many times, but people were so in love with the idea of the money. Apparently he made his own letterhead that he sent letters on, and it was completely bogus. It didn't look anything like NATO letterhead. And not only that, NATO doesn't acquire things that way. The individual members of NATO acquire things and make it available. It isn't like there was some giant top-level NATO development source that would even do such a thing. And if anyone,
but it was top secret. So
yeah, top secret, right? And apparently, when people first started complaining to EDS about this doesn't smell right, EDS came back to them and said it's because it's so top secret. And at the same time, and EDS claimed they'd actually done business with these people before, which I know there were some suits involved. I don't know whatever happened to them, but clearly.
Oh, I'm sure there was,
And then this came at a really bad time in that Semitech Global, the company that had bought Akai, found themselves in their own trouble. And I don't know the details of it. It didn't have to do with the Akai part of it, but they had, as I said, they had bought Singer, and then they bought a German sewing machine company called PFAFF, P-F-A-F-F, and which was a somewhat higher end, I guess, I don't know anything about the sewing machine market, obviously. But somewhere along that, something came out that Semitech Global had been doing not good things business-wise. There were problems, and Semitech Global apparently collapsed. And that was after I had left, so I don't have the details about what exactly happened. But it basically threw Akai into chaos. There was really no support for Akai. The consumer electronics brand, which Semitech had bought them for, ended up being sold to some generic Chinese company that were just making cheap VCRs and plastering the Akai name on it. And in fact, if you go to Akai.com today, you find like one page that hadn't been updated since 2017, talking about how they were looking for business partners, but clearly it's not a business. It doesn't exist. It literally doesn't exist. So that's very sad. I think the people that had been involved in the music division tried to get control of it again. I shouldn't say tried to get control, but tried to resurrect it. I do know that once I was at Akai, I did get a call from one of my old friends, one of my Japanese Akai friends, who was talking about setting up a new Akai music office in the United States and wanted to know if I wanted to be associated in it. And I was absolutely in Antares at that point and couldn't. But I don't know. I don't think that ever actually came to fruition. If it did, it was very short-lived. And then I think it was in 2005 that the In Music folk bought the rights to the Akai music brand. And I know some of the Akai people went to In Music to continue some of the initial MPC stuff. I think it was the MPC 4000, 5000, I forget exactly which. But so Akai lives on there within music, but it went through a death and got resurrected. Went through a couple deaths and got resurrected.
Sure. And that was one of the things when we spoke the other day. I was like, man, I wonder how that all affects Roger and his whole deal, whether that still carries forward or not, but who knows.
I don't know. I could ask Roger. I talked to Roger.
Maybe next time I talk to him, that's something that I can bring back up because that is it's always the juicy tidbits, and he tends to be pretty free flowing about that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so.
My guess is that the outright death of Akai may have been the death of the value of that contract. But I don't know. I mean, In Music ended up with that IP somehow, but I don't know what they paid. I don't know who they paid. I don't know. I have no idea how that works.
So let's talk about just to kind of close it out. Let's have a happy a happy ending and talk about one of the last projects that you did. I'm going to ask you to tell a little bit about how you got involved with KMFDM and how that worked out.
Well, I knew I was leaving Akai about 6 months before I left. I mean, I agreed with it. We had talked about, I was closing down the office, and they hadn't looked actually very carefully at the I hate to say it, they were not really good about contracts there at Akai. I mean, somebody wrote that contract that Roger signed, and I don't know who it was, but they didn't think it through very well, obviously. It was really good for Roger. And I had a contract that went for 3 years on the strategic marketing in my office. And when they decided they wanted to close things down, they missed the fact that that contract also said that that at the end of those 3 years, it could be renegotiated. But if nothing was renegotiated by the end of the 3 years, it automatically extended for 6 months. So by the time they decided they were going to close it down, it was past that. And so, we talked, and I said, okay, I've got another 6 months on my contract. And they were actually willing to let me go home and do nothing during those 6 months. But I felt an obligation. I was being paid, and I felt loyalty to the company. I'd had a great time there. And the people I was dealing with were not the people that were causing the problems in Hong Kong. So I spent those last 6 months working on a bunch of marketing stuff, and one of them was doing a new redesign of the website, doing the final marketing for the DPS12. I was working with Guitar Center to do some in-store dedicated demo kiosks for them and that sort of thing. So as part of the website redesign, I wanted to put in, each month or however often, let's feature a new artist. And unlikely as it may seem, I was mostly a jazz fan, not so much a metal or industrial fan, but I had become enamored of the band KMFDM that I'd encountered when I was still at E-MU, and I just thought they were a great band. I loved their music. They used some E-MU stuff. They also used some Akai stuff. So when it came time to pick the first artist to feature, I proposed. I didn't propose. I said, we're going to do KMFDM. And I got in touch with Sasha Knietsko, who was the founder. And at that point, he was living up in Seattle. And KMFDM has, changed key membership a bit over the years. And at this particular time, Tim Skold was the other main member, and they were working on an album. And I got in touch with them and went up and spent 3 days in Seattle just hanging out with them, asking questions, interviewing, doing video interviews. I remember doing a QuickTime VR was a thing in those days, and I had a setup for that. So I did like a 360-degree QuickTime VR of their studio, and then came back and wrote what I have to say, since I was leaving, I decided to be creative and wrote a rather fanciful story of their super heavy beat underground headquarters up there in Seattle, where they instigated the super heavy beat. And I should find it sometime. It was kind of amusing. And it was a great experience. It was actually probably the funnest experience of my end at Akai, and I really liked them, and I liked their music, and they were great. And it went live on the web, and people liked it. They loved it. So that was kind of my swan song at Akai. And unfortunately, I don't think that exists anymore. It died with 10 website versions ago. But,
yeah,
a lot of fun.
Died with Angel Fire.
Yeah.
Probably before that, actually, a good bit before that.
And they're still going. Once I was at Antares, I was giving them software to try out and stuff like that. And I still like their music. I have a lot of respect for the fact that they've continued to be creative all these years. Great band.
Absolutely.
Sasha's a very talented guy.
Well, listen, I want to thank you again so much for coming on. I love hearing these stories, and I'm sure everybody out here appreciates it so much. And just the entire span of your career. I mean, it's very impressive, and it's great to hear this stuff. So I really appreciate it.
Well, it's been a journey. I feel blessed to have been able to have a journey quite so stimulating and quite so full of excitement, quite frankly.
I want to give one more plug real quick. Let me do this. I have to type it in. So yeah, I didn't have this one pulled up ahead of time. But what we'll do is I'll do this like so. There we go. Yeah, how do I do it? There we go. There it is. Window. There it is. So I'll bring that up. So I just wanted to bring that up again and just say,
yay.
yeah, the 1200 reissue is back, and I like how it says latest in the SP12 family, so it's really taking it back there. So
well, we're really proud of this. Dave's done an astonishing job, not only recreating it this way, but an astonishing job of making sure that it encompasses everything that made the original SP1200 great. The reproduction of every element of the sound that made it.
I mean, it is a 1200. Like it just is a 1200,
Or 1200.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So yeah. And I tell you another thing that I've been really personally enjoying is the fact that he went ahead with SSI and redid those chips, the Fat Keys chips, and there's all which are showing up in more products now. So it's really great to see those filters kind of in more. Like you can see right behind me, I've got a Prophet 5, which is now a Prophet 10. I just upgraded it to the 10 voice. So it's got a bunch of those chips in there.
Yeah. Well,
great.
One of the things I've got to say, and again, I'm just jumping back to E-MU for a moment, because for all of the companies I've been in, the years I spent at Akai, the huge number of years I spent at Antares, and now Rossum Electro Music, E-MU just has such a special place, in my experience, certainly in my career, because the people that I worked with then, I've just continued to be close to, have continued to work with them. The people at Rossum Electro Music are virtually all old E-MU people. SSI, it's Dan Parks. It's Dan Parks that was there that in the original solid state music when those chips were originally made. And it's so much is happening today that just has a direct path from all those people that created so much amazing stuff back in the E-MU days that it's just, it's so great to see. It really is. It's an emotional thing to see.
Absolutely.
Through the through line of all of this stuff all the way back from those early years.
Yeah, we were talking the other day, and I was saying, the Bright Sparks interview with Tom Oberheim had gone up, and which is a wonderful documentary. I highly recommend people check it out. And early on in it, you're watching it, and they note how they licensed from Dave Rossum, and I say that is the most common thread in all of these stories. It always kind of comes back to something he did in one way or the other, ends up in all the classic gear. So it's just like, it's a beautiful thing.
It is indeed. And one of the things that have really made me extremely happy about what we've accomplished at Rossum Electro Music is not just the products, which are of course superb, but that it's given us an opportunity to introduce to the wider audience what Dave's been about all these years. And I have to say, it was one of my goals when I talked to Dave about our starting this is yes, we want to make some great products, but I think it's really time the world learns in a lot more detail what you have accomplished through these years. And I'm really happy. I feel it's worked out that way. As a marketing person, that was certainly one of my goals there that I feel that has been pretty successful. I feel really good about it.
And again, that goes back to what I discussed with you the other day, where it's, I thoroughly feel like some of the nicest, best personality people that I've ever met who are brilliant people, they
Mhm.
tend to go to the background and they kind of like fall behind things. And
Mhm.
that's kind of why I started this whole show to begin with, was because
Mhm.
I knew that these people weren't getting the shine that they deserved. I wanted, as they say, give them their flowers now, because uh, you know, he absolutely deserves to be up there. And I feel like your contribution as well. I mean, this is all none of this happens without, proper marketing, proper, sales, and getting products into people's hands at the end of the day. None of this happens without that.
Yeah.
So it's
I have been so lucky to work with so many talented teams. The team at E-MU was fabulous. The team at Akai is fabulous, I must say. Even though didn't know a lot of them, the ones that were working kind of anonymously in Japan, but their results speak for themselves. Brilliant people, and Taris, and of course, returning to the source at Rossum Electromusic. It's been my joy to work with people that talented.
well, I hope that you're enjoying retirement, which
So far, so good in what has
that's
turned into a surreal time in our lives.
wonderful. Well, I thank you again so much. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who's watching. And please feel free to share stuff around. I keep forgetting to do this. Look, watch. Look, I'll do it now. There. I'm
Yeah.
terrible at this whole like
Subscribe,
influencing.
subscribe. Be sure to subscribe.
Yeah, if you want to see more content like this, and just there's a whole bunch of interviews with people that I thoroughly feel just deserve to be listened to. So and apparently Shuri, my dog over here, thinks she should be listened to as well. So just go check that stuff out, and I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.